Okay, this is going to be, by its nature, necessarily a confused recording. I'm going to try to talk about the polarization in American politics and the unconscious shadow work that undergirds all of these sorts of things. I'm not an American myself. I would label myself an enlightened observer. Um, and I'll try to go through all of these layers of issue or something like that. And I mean, I'm going to be covering a lot of large themes and things like that. And let me just say that the critique that I make and that I lay at the feet of one party or another party or of one side or another side, what gives me the right to do that is that I have a diagnosis on the deep cause, on the level of cause, not on the level of effect and symptom. I have a diagnosis on the level of cause, and I'm willing to defend that intellectually. And I'm willing to rebuke people who criticize or critique or disagree with me. And that is what gives me the ticket to enter the circus and to say you're all clowns and I'm not a clown. Okay, so that's how that works. Now, there are a lot of people who, in their own mind, they want the show to go on. They want the circus to perpetuate, in some sense, because in some sense that's the deep sickness and that's the problem of the American system itself, which even began in the War of Independence. There's a lot of unconsciousness which was baked into the fudged pie uh, that America sits with. And I would say that the main toxic aftermath of that, uh, in some sense, George Washington should have become the king of America. He should have, because that's exactly what America needed, because they weren't yet ready to produce a proper legal tradition and a legal system. I mean, sorry, talking about deep history here, and I know that this is offensive to a lot of people. Um, but frankly, I don't care about your nationalism. Although in general, I am on the side of the right. I'm on the side of the Republicans, or at least of the Trump supporting populist Republicans. They, I think, are largely in the right on all of these issues in the modern context. But I understand the structural poison in the system itself, uh, which is effectively that it was not time in history to produce a legal tradition that could actually support um, the emergence from the British Empire with a form of governance uh, that kept the dignity of its citizenry. There is no dignity for a citizen in America. You are lab rats, part of an experiment that was started by George Washington, who didn't have the balls to crown himself king of America. And so you ended up with a constitution that had a Bill of Rights that wasn't even in the main text. It was in the amendment section. And you could say, well, that's because you have state constitutions and you have independent states. Uh, I mean, the whole thing is deficit and deficient in so many respects. But essentially, the problem with the American system is that it does not have the rule of law. It has a fabrication, it has a mimicry of the rule of law, and that's exactly what you're suffering from, even in today, essentially, is that your judges are not real judges, they're all magistrates. That they're all creatures of statute, they're all secretaries of the executive and the legislative branch, and there's who's to stand up for the citizen, because the citizen has no proper recourse when you live in a land that has a wicked legal tradition that does not have the rule of law. You have due process instead. Due process and supposedly equal protection under the law. What does that mean when you don't have laws of general application? And America does not have laws of general application because the substantive law is unfinished. It's being experimented. It is ad hocly promulgated and changed and repealed by the legislative. It's a circus. there isn't enough protection. Your so-called rights are useless because they are void for their vagueness. The pursuit of happiness, does that help you? The right to pursue your happiness, does that get you to do what? Can you not pay your income taxes? No, you can't use that right to stop yourself from paying income taxes because that's a legitimate government purpose and it's rational. And that's all the judge has to come up with and rationalize to invalidate one of your rights in the Bill of Rights. They're useless rights. They don't have clear remedies. They're non-justiciable. You do not have laws of general application. That's a separate point. The substance of the law is changing. Uh, and the weak framing of the constitutional frameworks, because of I'm talking including the states, but also their malleability. These are not supreme constitutions. They're supreme until they are amended by a legislative body. You have the rule of man. You don't have the rule of law in America. You're all lab rats, part of an experiment to find the rule of law, supposedly. Um, and in that mess, you have the iniquity of the American system and the wickedness of essentially the wickedness that the promise of the rights, the symbolic promise of the rights that you do have, are only defended at the ballot box, essentially. That's what it boils down to, de facto. And in some sense, when you have these incredibly wicked, ideologically possessed people, these disgusting racists on the left, social justice warriors, Black Lives Matter type people, when they ever lose in a court case, if they ever don't get their way because of the justice system, they don't hear the judge saying, what you want is unreasonable, what you want is immoral or amoral, and I rule against you. This is a metaphoric generalization, so please bear with this. This is a motif that I'm drawing to make a point. That if a social justice ever loses in court, that's not what they hear the judge saying. What the judge says to them instead is, you don't have enough political power to make me rule in your favor yet. Go win more political power, and then I'll do what you want. That's what judges say to people that use the justice system. It's a disgusting, wicked system. Now, that's a bit too harsh in historical terms, because you could even say that America has had to then rely, because it is a due process system, it has had to try to create procedures that have their own sort of balancing act within themselves. And that sort of balancing of process or something like that is even, I would say, akin to the kind of the scientific pretension of expert false authority, that, oh no, the process is fair enough, essentially, and that's a good enough substitution that we can even label it the rule of law and not the rule of man. Anyway, that's a deep unconscious thread that undergirds the whole American mess, to put it quite frankly. That America has always had the shaky, sandy ground of a constitutional order. And it was a crisis waiting to happen. It was only stabilized ever by, you could say, the culture, by the freedom-loving culture or something like that. But the elites and the plutocracy could always abuse the system, and I would even lay this at the feet of Hamilton and Madison. These revolutionaries who had great pretension to be aristocrats themselves and to be part of a plutocrat. Anyway, there's no necessary reason to project malfeasance and motivational sort of nefariousness onto individuals in history, where we can just say that the system itself is fundamentally deficient. Now, anyway, let me see. I want to talk about. So when the left tries to react to this by creating some kind of other alternative procedural, um, it's always some kind of hypothetical. It's always hedged on, well, something must be done and we don't quite know what. So we'll just do something in the meantime, and we need it for our security because of the hypothetical worry or the hypothetical threat or something like that. And to tell you the truth, that's the only thing I hold against Andrew Yang, who I thought otherwise was at least broke the democratic narrative to the extent to which that he would, let's say, openly um, promote his political message to the populist right. But I do think that his solutions are not, let's say, they're not core enough in some sense. And Andrew Yang perhaps, to me, symbolizes perhaps another way to kind of kick the can down the road of this fundamental crux within the American soul, which is this toxicity that is even inherited from its War of Independence. I mean, and I can characterize the American War of Independence to some degree, which is that, and this is not to say that the British were perfect people by any means, but I mean, in some sense, I mean, a lot of people had two minds about the American War because they considered themselves British subjects and British, citizens of the British Empire. But what precipitated the war was essentially, you could say, political corruption in Britain, but it wasn't necessarily clear that it was political corruption because Britain didn't have, let's say, the structure that stopped it from abusing its colonies. And so instead of perhaps waging a war, an intellectual sort of war of letters, of complaint and a kind of intellectualism against the British Parliament, America tarred and feathered tax collectors. And at the same time, it was a revolution that I would say was largely proselytized by lawyers. And you have to remember what lawyers were like in those days. They actually had little purses tied into their ponytails because they were fucking vending machines. You would put in a coin for them to stand up and say the next argument or counter argument. And, how much, when you had a wealthy client, would you essentially get into perhaps obtuse forms of back and forth exchange just to extract more payment from one's prospective client? I wonder how much collusion was there really between both sides, to get into interesting tangents and such and such. Now, that's an interesting dynamic is there, because in some sense, when you do that, then you can, let's say, the awareness of the client not to wish to pay to have that line of argument or wishing to have that line of argument pushed forward, in some sense, has a pecuniary connection between the client and the awareness of let's say, the state of the substantive law that's governing that section of the case, or the importance of that section of the case. Anyway, that's an interesting parallel tangent, but in some sense, although it was dirty, it was also somewhat more honest because it kept the system. People had eyes on each other. They had a certain level of practical vigilance, in that system. It was more embodied in some sense. And you can say, well, these things should just run automatically, that the lawyer should have a brief, should be paid, and then should do it to the best of their ability. And then, how much is the client actually sitting beside during the litigation process, literally paying the lawyer like you would activate a vending machine. Anyway, and I think in some sense that this culture has been frozen within the American experiment. This embodiment in practice, these practices never ended. Um, they just got masked under some legal rhetoric, some legal structure. Anyway, I mean, I don't want to go too. You see, this already is probably way too hard to follow, and it's an interesting motif. It's an interesting sort of layer on top of this, and I perhaps didn't condense it that well. But again, I only bring up these things because I actually believe that I have a vision of the actual synthesis, of the cultural settlement, of the solution to these problems. And that on that basis, I disagree with Andrew Yang. So it's not because I think that his heart is in the wrong place or something like that. I just think he doesn't go deep enough. He goes shallow. Um, and in some sense, the only person that I would endorse on the left in politics would probably be Tulsi Gabbard. I think she's the only one who hasn't given in to this disgusting narrative on the left that essentially, well, the left uses this bank of hypothetical fear, this hypothetical technical, I mean, I see these things even mentioned by people in Rebel Wisdom. Oh, well, we can't just have absolute free speech in the public domain. We need to have some kind of something. Therefore, you know, the left is allowed to as long as that they can have a party line and no one breaks the party line, then they can kind of concoct a narrative, and then that's the only solution on the table or something like that. So we have to just kind of go along with that. There's not what was being argued by Rebel Wisdom, but that or by the one guy in Rebel Wisdom. I'm sorry, I'm so bad with recalling people's names. But that is the kind of the de facto default when you aren't more particular about, let's say, being sensitive to hypothetical fear mongering. Um, I mean, I have specifically dealt with that particular issue as it was even raised on Rebel Wisdom. I think I've created a 40-minute recording disabusing people or attempting to disabuse people of that particular construction of that false dilemma, as if Parler does not have restrictions. They do have restrictions. They don't have absolute free speech. Their restrictions, though, are quite reasonable and defensible and actually make sense or completely justifiable, which is that there must be particularized danger. There must be particularized a breach of the law or incitement to breach the law. Particular, not just a kind of general reductive, nebulous, kind of thumb-sucked, oh, well, our side doesn't like it. Our side is confident enough to hold the party line and accuse people of inciting sedition. Never mind the hypocrisy built into that. No one on the left I've heard, no one in Rebel Wisdom, although I didn't listen to the whole recording, I found myself that it was just getting far too... the left really does live in their fucking narrative bubble. It's quite disgusting. That and I would lump the Rebel Wisdom people into inverted commas the left, and they are still basically indirectly plugged into the fucking narrative. They don't spend nearly as enough time listening to the other side, which the quality and the values and the substance of which, I mean, yes, sometimes the substance is a little bit iffy, is a little bit lacking, and I would say that is generally, again, the fault of the left and not the right. Because there's no one engaging them from the left. There's no one engaging in the values debate and the intellectual debate. It's not happening at the left at all, because when you go onto CNN, you just have objective reporting, and you cannot ask questions back of the professional journalist, because that's not what you do to professional journalists. So they hold themselves out to be professional and not to be partisan. I mean, it's, if you accept those premises, I mean, you've already closed your fucking eyes. I mean, I'm sorry, but this is pathetic. And in some sense, I think that what happens on the right in Fox News, which the form of which is much more fair and honest, because you could call it enlightened subjectivism or something like that. If there is a problem there, it's not a problem of Fox News, it's a problem of the particular anchor who has made an embarrassing argument. And often what they've done is they've tried to mimic the ire of the left. They've tried to mimic the kind of brittle form of intellectual gainsaying that the left does, and because essentially the right is there with an actual argument that needs to be hashed out, but no one will debate it with them, then they try to kind of leverage the fact that that argument has not been met into, let's say, the same kind of overreach that the left does in their narrative projection. And it is hypocritical when they do that in some sense, because they somewhat undermine their ability to call out the left. But essentially it's because, how the fuck can a whole left wing be so patently dishonest and uncareful and unserious? How can they be so bound up in their own propaganda, essentially? Whereas you can't say that about Fox News, because you would be able to go onto Fox News, give the other side, and then when you heard the retort, you could again argue back. You could do that on Fox News. You can't argue back on CNN. That, in some sense, they'll give you some kind of controlled. I mean, you can't say that Tucker Carlson doesn't have real back and forth. You can't say that in the Five, I can't remember what the name of the program is, they don't have a real person there actually giving the other argument, the other side of the argument. But I mean, sadly, it's so much fucking propaganda. It's pathetic. And I'm talking about the left. I'm not talking about the right. But yes, the left does indulge. The right does also indulge in a kind of counter propaganda, and it does undermine its moral credibility. And in some sense, you could also say that they're pandering to their lowest common denominator. So it's a bit of a circus on the right. I mean, I'll admit that. But the truth is within the right. It's not within the left. And in some sense, the people that complain that the left does not have, that people aren't being sympathetic enough to the left or something like, oh, that's just because their whole strategy is on extraction of sympathy and yet more sympathy and doom spiraling into yet a more corrosive authoritarian tyrannical narrative. Anyway, okay, I'm talking about themes here. There is no value debate. There is no intellectual debate on the left. It just doesn't happen. So now let me post hoc justify I mean, to call what happened on 6th of January sedition is pathetic and stupid and hypocritical for the left to do. What about the Kavanaugh hearings? I mean, I would say that it was symbolic of sedition. It was, and it was designed to be that way by a group of people that have not been heard because of the color of their skin, even, who were probably shot. I mean, how many people in the Black Lives Matter Antifa riots were shot by police officers? How many of those were killed by police officers? How many of those deaths were basically caused by the rioters themselves? And if you compare that to January the 6th, who are the people that were shot? People that were unarmed. Who were the only officer that was killed by the rioters? And I don't know the details. But if anything, I would say that all the deaths I would lay at the feet of an establishment of a moral hypocrisy. If that right-wing riot was treated the same as a left-wing riot, would there have been the same death toll? I mean, frankly, this de facto shows the de facto constitutional crisis, the constitutional stasis that America is in. There is not due process anymore. There is not equal protection under the law. I don't think that you can say that this has shown that the American system is fundamentally broken. That America has no process to check up on this kind of hypocrisy other than the ballot box, which is literally the even the cause of this, in some sense, the allegation that the integrity of the election, the integrity of the election itself is questionable. And I think that cannot be a controversial statement. If 45% of your population think that question the integrity of the election, it cannot then be controversial that the integrity of the election is questionable. That at least must be accepted as a common fact, as common cause. But you see, America is such a twisted, legally toxic nation that even that is understood to be a political sentiment and a political claim, and not even one that is justiciable in law. Or if it is justiciable, that claim itself, it's irrelevant, because what would it be part of? What would the action be that claim would be a part of? America does not have an ability, other than what the legislature allows, other than the houses themselves, what the legislative body itself is in charge of the election. I mean, there's a fundamental paradox here. It's quite disgusting, and it shows the weakness of the judiciary. It shows the wound and the gap in the judiciary, which was even caused by the War of Independence. When you created the structure, this due process structure, it's not good enough. It's not the rule of law. It's the rule of man. All comes back to that. It all comes back to the fact that a rich man can always procedurally exhaust you, essentially. Or if you don't want to be procedurally exhausted, then maybe you can have a full bench. And then what will happen is you'll have to contend with the toxic precedent, because all the law in America is a fucking science experiment that's unfinished. And maybe 2 years later, there'll be a promulgation in which that case that happened before a full bench 2 years ago without a jury trial, so that you could actually get your justice. But now the law has changed, and now you would have won that case, but then you lost that case at the time because of the current state of the precedent. Because the substantive general application of the law is unfinished. It's a fucking science experiment. You're a fucking lab rat. And so in that process as well, if you're an expert enough and you wield enough false authority, you can help to fudge the system and get anyone to win a case. And what about the principle of the matter? The substantive law in America is trial and error by the legislative. The law in America is founded in trial and error. It does not have laws of general application. It cannot have the rule of law until it has laws of general application. Due process is not enough. This is a very technical, highly intellectual point. It's very simple. But, you have to work out what the fucking law is, and then you have to apply it evenly across the board, and then you have tools that citizens can go and defend themselves against the state, against the Leviathan, against whatever. You don't have those protections because you don't live in a real republic. You live in a democracy. You live in the rule of man. You don't live in a republic. Because the Constitution is fundamentally non-justiciable, because it's void for vagueness. The rights in the Bill of Rights are void because they are vague. They do not have clear remedies. Without a remedy, there is no right. You do not have rights. You have lines in the sand until a judge can say that there's a legitimate government purpose and it's rational to redraw those lines. And even if you want to say, well, the original framing, that those lines in the sand, they stay, they're not good enough, because you can only truly defend those lines at the ballot box. And you can say, well, now what about the question of the ballot box? Because now that's what this whole thing is. It's the question of the ballot box. And again, the left is fundamentally fucking hypocritical, because they wanted to get down to the bottom of it when the Russia impeachment and the Russia Steele dossier and all that bullshit and all that fabricated, essentially it was a hoax. If you just look at the de facto political hypocrisy, which somehow this gets swept under the rug. And yes, people on the right, they see this, and so what did they do? Did they actually do an insurrection? Did they actually do a sedition? No, they didn't. They did it symbolically because they were fucking fed up, and they had a right to be fed up with this kind of treatment of the mainstream media and the political class and the fake news. and the moral hypocrisy and inconsistency. This is the de facto constitutional crisis that America is in. And, the hypocrisy of the left is conspicuous, is utterly disgusting and conspicuous. And these are the people who, if you did have the rule of law, these people, Pelosi, Biden even, and would perhaps be censured by courts at the very least. They would be censured by courts for overstepping the mark. But you don't have law that has a decent enough system to keep the hypocrisy of the left in check. Now, that is even a crazy kind of thing to sound, well, because that means that I'm saying that, freedom of speech is not absolute and all these sorts of things. I will now create a demonstration about how this would be how these kinds of rights would function. You need a principle of equality in law, which is not the same thing as a right of equality. It would be something like the practice of equality. Equality has to be a procedural kind of fair balancing, but it has to be very precisely calibrated in very clear procedural terms, in some sense. So that's the practice of equality, not the right of equality. And in some sense, the practice of equality is about how to balance all the rights that people should have, and then you've actually got a mechanism that allows you to limit rights. Because if you don't, because rights will always be limited. There's no such thing as an absolute right. It's stupid in some sense to even think that you might have. You have to have a limitations clause in which the citizen can actually defend and maximize their enjoyment of a right or minimize the infringement of that right by somebody else after you've got some kind of practice of equality set up in the law, in the structure of the law. And then the people who administer that is the judiciary. That's the function of a judiciary, and that is how the judiciary ends up, in some sense, being the highest, let's say, aspect in the system. It ends up. I mean, it can't. When it is creative, it's forced to being creative because of the unfolding of the principle in the law itself, that the substantive law is not being changed, it's merely being discovered in application. That's essentially a kind of common law notion, but you have to combine it with a substantive law that is, in principle, complete. And this means that also you need to have a principled, holistic substantive structure, which in my legal tradition, which I think actually has the solution to all of these problems, is a Roman Dutch substantive law that has a kind of common law surrounding it with the Supreme Constitution. That kind of mixed system is exactly what you need. I know that I just said a whole lot of things, and I've got other recordings that go into this deeply, but so just to kind of skip through some of these things, but the importance sort of here, let me tell you how some of these things basically should work in practice, just to get you a flavor of it. But let me just say as well that this is not how it works in my country, because the legal tradition in my country has been corrupted by this noxious proto-fascistic identity politics. That essentially also that American legal scholars came to my country to teach us about the governmental prerogative, to help corrupt and facilitate the institutionalized corruption that now exists in my system. But that institutionalized corruption was first in the political realm, in the political arena, in the ruling party, and then the law was corrupted in order to facilitate it. Quite disgusting. And I would lay that at the feet of America, and because we got your race and gender studies in our academia undermining the constitutional values, undermining the constitutional structure, but supposedly because of academic freedom and because of freedom of expression, public money was put into funding anti-constitutional propaganda. I mean, it's disgusting. So, and this is kind of the example that I would give, is that if you want to have a private university, I would say that you could be as racist as you want to be. For example, my nation is built on non-racialism and non-sexism is one of the key values, or a higher value would be an open liberal democracy that has those values that I just mentioned, the value of non-racialism, for instance. So that means, somewhat quite simply, that no public money, no public support should go towards a message that is racialistic. But, quite disgustingly in my system, racialism is fundamentally endorsed by legislation directly. It's quite disgusting, but it's the corruption of the times, as it were. The weird thing, though, is that in my legal tradition, it's actually incompatible with the law itself. It's incompatible with the Constitution, which has now been misinterpreted on purpose in order to validate this kind of proto-fascism, essentially, which is, in some sense, that belongs to America. That corruption, that constitutional crisis, is an American constitutional crisis. It's not a South African constitutional crisis, which is my country. So my country has been bogged down and brought into the American constitutional crisis, which belongs to America, because you've got deep structural problems, not in society, not in culture, in some sense, in that the moral framing of the law is fundamentally compartmentalized amoralism, because only politics proves that the morality is the way that it is, or something like that. And so, people don't actually have recourse to defend their rights, because their rights are essentially non-justiciable, or they're void because they're vague, or essentially you don't have rights because you don't have remedies. You have some sketchy remedies that might, if they make it through that very strange gauntlet of legitimate government purpose and rational. In some sense, the Supreme Court in America is the only court that has the power of review, and obviously the circuits and such are there in some sense to entertain. Anyway, I there's no point in talking about it, but look, there are some mechanisms in the American system. I'm not going to say, but those mechanisms are in principle they're not good enough to guarantee the rule of law. There's certainly not the rule of law in America. You can say that there are things that might approximate towards that, or something like that, in terms of the brilliance of the structure. And again, I'm very sympathetic, because that's what happens when you make a republic too early in history. And in some sense, I would also say what was boiled into this is that if Americans had rather opened their eyes and looked at the corruption in the British Parliament and absorbed that wound and ruminated over it and actually tried to solve it from the perspective of King George and the Parliament itself, because King George was, in some sense, at war with his own Parliament, because he was trying to get them to make a kind of a government of national unity where the best people from each party would come together to make the best policy. But Parliament didn't want that for itself. It wanted to have factions, to have party politics, to work out they wanted to work out how to navigate between ideological divisiveness. That was, in some sense, that was part of the story from the British side of it. And instead of America, let's say, taking the injustice of taxation without representation, but seeing the crux, the core of what was emanating this injustice inside the British political system, perhaps they would have learned to and educated themselves in the fundamental, at least in principle, solve the problem before you bake that into your own legal structure. I mean, in some sense, Britain had a better, because you see, Britain also felt the wound of the American War of Independence, and that informed their culture. That became a cultural memory. But there was a problem on both sides. of the pond, as they say, because the British system never developed an actual structure to formalize the injustice that they did to the American people that precipitated the War of Independence. So Britain never learned how to rein itself in a constitutional way, and America developed a shitty constitution that in some sense vindicated the War of Independence, but without actually resolving the underlying moral quandary, which is something like, how to have a just nation, how to have a legal system that structures a just nation. But Britain came out of that slightly better than America did, because Britain didn't say this is what the legal system is. We're going to define it. We're going to create, let's say, a very formal. They had a growing cultural tradition, and so it was alive within their culture. America had this kind of parallel system where they use their legal tradition as a form of political propaganda, because again, you can only guarantee your rights in the federal constitution by use of the ballot box, essentially, and you get some half protection from the Supreme Court, but you don't get to properly, let's say, in some sense, the rights in the American Bill of Rights, in terms of there being actual legal protections, it's more of a political rhetoric as a form of protection in the political sphere, and very, very limited protection that it offers people in court. But essentially, it's kind of split between both realms, and therefore that balancing act, in some sense, it puts the people of America on notice, that so they know that it's split between. I mean, I would say culturally that they know this. They know that it's split between these two. Now, that they only get limited protections from the judiciary, and they need to kind of make sure that they vote the right way if they want to really hold on to their rights, essentially. Which is, that's not what a constitution should be. You shouldn't have to. I mean, it's interesting, but I guess the one thing that might actually be missing in my system now is because in some sense my system was so set up so well that it didn't have impeachment. And actually, I must check the Constitution for impeachment, because in some sense we're going to have to probably impeach judges who are so ideologically corrupt with this identity politics, who promulgated this disgusting law, or we're going to have some kind of judicial revolution in which some kind of quorum of judges is going to stand up against the corruption in the jurisprudence itself that developed essentially to disguise and to corroborate the kind of institutionalized corruption which is obviously sort of this weird kind of political unaccountability, in which an individual citizen cannot actually defend their constitutional rights anymore, just because of the toxic rhetoric that is used, just because of a hypothetical fear. I mean, the COVID-19 is a perfect example. This idea of this hypothetical, which is all based on a field of knowledge, epidemiology, in which human beings do not fully understand everything about the immune system and epidemiology. And we've never gone to war with a COVID virus before. We have no idea what the long-term repercussions of trying to eradicate a virus like this. I would argue that vaccinating against it and trying to slow it down at every point is exactly what is going to create it, is going to exacerbate mutation of the strain into something much more serious and deadly. if we had already achieved herd immunity before it mutated, perhaps it wouldn't have mutated. But essentially, because we have tried to slow it down at every step, instead of what we did for swine flu, we didn't even do anything about it, and we just got over it fairly quickly. And there was quite a lot of human carnage from swine flu as well. But I would argue that the potential carnage was mitigated by not trying to slow it down, get it over and done with. And there were also about 3 or 4 waves of swine flu at some point, that happened at different points. But at every point, we were probably much more safe because we were allowing it to happen much faster. And a lot of the numbers are actually inflated, not just because of politics, but because essentially the influenza season that we had this year was incredibly not deadly. So people that would have died to the influenza strain were taken by COVID or something like that. And because we, even when we had hospital capacity, we were slowing the spread of this thing. That just meant that when it did mutate to something more contagious, which is almost, you would expect something to evolve, a more higher kind of ability to be contagious if you are minimizing its contact. So in some sense, life finds a way, it adapts. We don't know how sustainable any of these measures that we are taking are, or even the vaccination. We've never gone to war with the coronavirus. And it's also, in terms of the epigenetic impact that this is going to have on public health as a whole, I mean, this is just human experimentation. I mean, we don't even recognize perhaps the vast, and these are sorts of things that you have to talk about when you're talking about public health, but essentially, people that would have been killed by coronavirus now are, if we do succeed in removing coronavirus, means that when another kind of virus comes along, they're going to have a human host to incubate them, to perhaps mutate within, that otherwise they would have been taken out by a coronavirus. Instead, they're going to be incubators of other viruses. So in some sense, unless we're going to go to war with all of virology and we're going to try to take out every single thing that is infectious, unless we're going to do that, I mean, I would just say you have to tread lightly here because you don't know what you're doing. This is a form of human experimentation on a large scale. Public health is a complicated field. And you have to remember, we used to have deadly flus. We used to have flus that every 20 to 30 years, when we had sea ships, before we had air travel, we used to have a deadly flu, and it would kill children as much as it killed adults. This virus does not kill children to the same, the children that it does kill are children that essentially have immunocompromised systems, or they have pre-existing conditions, generally speaking. But children as a category are not at great danger, just for that categorization of their being a child. And the kind of fear mongering, but also, I mean, people that are in the, I mean, right now the hospitals in many places in my country are being completely overrun, and I would say that, again, this is being very toxically diverted onto people who have said from the start that these public health policies are irresponsible, they're unintelligent, and they don't know what they're doing. But also, there's a lot of arbitrary, unneeded economic carnage that's going on, and that also has a public health cost. And because we continued to slow the spread of the virus, even when we had hospital capacity, I would say that we have exacerbated now, what you resist persists. That's a pretty good generalization, actually. That works for a lot of things. It's kind of like, that's almost the in terms of shadow work and unconscious shadow work, that's a pretty golden sort of principle to kind of it's not always, what is resistance? Are you resisting or are you responding? And if you're going to respond, then justify your position and defend it intellectually, properly. Don't base it on, well, the other person doesn't know what they're talking about. They're a bad guy, and therefore my opposition to them makes me a good guy. That's the narrative formula that we, I mean, the kind of closed-mindedness, the kind of, it's almost like you make yourself a comedian, that you're allowed to satirically um, invalidate your opponent instead of actually dealing with them in any way, shape, or form in an intellectually honest way. So we have, I would say, in my country at least, a government created, exacerbated crisis. And I would say it is created by the response to the virus, which you could say as well is America's fault to some degree, because you could say, well, look what happened in America, they had to follow suit, because otherwise they would, be the next Thabo Mbeki. They would just be removed from office if they didn't follow the lowest common denominator, if they didn't sort of conform to the narrative. And I do think that a lot of that narrative might have been manufactured uh, in order to get something like mail-in voting, which, at least in theory, would have largely helped Biden, because I can imagine Trump supporters risking their lives with COVID voting in person, and people not actually having that kind of moral zeal to do the same for Biden. But if something was already mailed to you and you just had to kind of throw it back in some kind of postal sort of system, anyway. So I mean but I mean, in some sense, even and that's not even to talk about explicit sort of dominion voting problems that probably do need to be investigated, and I think are probably, if you look at the statistical anomalies, I mean, I on that basis, I think it's actually reasonable to conclude that there was more likely fraud than not. But also, even putting that aside, the election interference by big tech. I mean, that itself could have been the difference. I mean, so there are at least three separate courses in which you can say that this whole thing was a manufactured outcome, which is very nefarious in any of those three. But one of them is even so bold-facedly explicit, and it's not being looked at. I mean, like, why didn't Jack Dorsey and Mark Zuckerberg be put on answer, being compelled to give an answer as to their election interference in quashing the Hunter Biden story? I mean, this is George Orwell 1984. It's not happening from the government side. It's happening from the big corporation side. And this is why, I mean, the last one is specifically why the whole argument that the rebel wisdom guy was mentioning about, oh, you can't just have absolute free speech. I mean, like, really, no one in practice. I mean, like, in political theory and in philosophy, you know people might say that as a rhetorical thing, but who in practice? Parler doesn't practice absolute free speech, but they need particularized. The threat has to be particularized. It cannot just be a kind of general sort of thing. And in some sense, you can say, well, people are going to do what they're going to do at the end of the day. I mean, why are you generalizing the guilt onto the platform? In some sense, that's the essence of Section 230. That was the function of Section 230. And in some sense, it doesn't matter. Why are you controlling the effects of what people do on the ground? who the fuck cares what people do on the ground? What happened on January the 6th, apart from the people that died, who did not deserve to die, who should not have died in some sense, and I think that they would not have died if that was a left-wing riot, which is, I think, wholly an indictment against the American system, but against the American political establishment and against the mainstream media. If you want to know why those 5 people died, I would blame CNN, and I would blame the disproportionate coverage from CNN much more than even, but in terms of the actual, so when they were left, the Kavanaugh hearings, basically, if you just see how the Democrats signaled what happened around that, and you applied that to these right-wing riots, and yes, they ransacked the Capitol, and they did damage to things. I would say hardly in a, I mean, were they marauding, killing people? No. The only people that died were unarmed protesters and and an officer who I don't know the surrounding circumstances. But I imagine that, in the midst in which 4 unarmed people died and that one officer dies, in some sense, I mean, I don't know the particular circumstances, but it doesn't seem unreasonable that there was a disproportionate use of force, and if there was a different political, if they were wearing a different hat, if they had a different flag, they would have been treated with much more care and respect. Perhaps if the officers had kneeled to this right-wing riot, perhaps if they had kneeled before them, then no one would have died, and they would have just continued to symbolically ransack, because they did not commit insurrection and sedition. They were doing so symbolically. They were actively doing so symbolically. And in some sense, what the FBI is now doing, I mean, you talk about government, Biden has talked about truth and reconciliation. Such fucking hypocrisy. But anyway, I mean, I do think that, I mean, questioning the legitimacy of Joe Biden's presidency is much more rational and reasonable than questioning the legitimacy of Trump's presidency. And we're not allowed to get to the bottom of the questions around the Biden election. Such hypocrisy. But sorry, what was the point that I was getting onto? Was the third leg was the election interference by Twitter and Facebook, quashing the Hunter Biden story. And the problem is that now that the Democratic establishment, I mean, is so plugged into this toxic narrative and these toxic formula. I mean, the hypocrisy is so conspicuous, and now if they hold the seat of power, what I mean, we're probably about to receive some kind of McCarthyist. And I was even going to talk about McCarthyism within the context of the things that I've been talking about. Anyway, this has gone on. This recording has gone on much too long, but yeah, and I think I make myself qualified to talk about McCarthyism because I actually have a vision of how these things can be resolved. Because I mean, it is complicated, but basically, I believe that even the McCarthyism was necessary, but it was unjustifiable. But in some sense, you could say in history, well, they're doing the best they can or something like that, and it's relatively justified. But objectively, morally, it's unjustifiable what happened to McCarthyism, but it was necessary. So you see how this needs to be resolved within the American constitutional framework. Okay, sorry, I said I was going to demonstrate how some of these things would happen in effect. So I would say that you can even have a racist university, but you can't take public money and you can't be publicly licensed or something like that. If you want to have, so basically in my country, all the radio waves, all the radio broadcasting is essentially the bandwidth is owned by the government, is dispensed by the government. So in how I see this is that a private individual could maybe call up and make a racial statement and try to talk about racialism if that is their particular ideological bent or something like that. They would have the freedom of expression to do that. It wouldn't be hate speech. I don't believe in hate speech, but you wouldn't be able to have a publicly paid or a radio host that is pushing racialism, which is quite ironic because in the current system, it's almost the opposite. It is that all the public radio people all have to push identity politics and black fascism, essentially, or proto-fascism, whatever you want to call it. And if you phone up and disagree with it, they will actually threaten you. They will literally say, well, you should worry about the security because if you don't let us be right in our ideological disgusting pretentiousness and pseudo-intellectualism, then, you should watch your back. Your days are numbered, essentially. They will even, that's the kind of political rhetoric that we have in South Africa. It's Weimar Germany, essentially. So we have these very radical fascist parties like the EFF, Julius Malema, who, as far as I can tell, metaphorically is the black reincarnation of Hitler himself, who has obviously read Mein Kampf. I will not actually believe that he has not read Mein Kampf because he's using it like an instruction manual. I don't know if he's read it or not, but he's using it like an instruction manual. So if we take that kind of toxic rhetoric that then ends up being mouthed by the president himself, who has to pander and cater to this disgusting ideology while undermining the Constitution and the values of the Constitution, which has become normalized because of these race and gender studies professors that, as far as I'm concerned, should be charged with constitutional damages for teaching this in public institutions to learners, to students. But essentially, that if you want to do that, you can still do that under freedom of expression, but you mustn't be supported by the state in doing so. And that's simply because, the state has an obligation to ensure the rights in the Constitution and to provide those rights to its citizens. And so if any kind of state power or government power is, the exception to this would be the judiciary, because the judiciary has to understand this objectively and it has to draw the line. So obviously, judges can't be biased into siding with the executive and the legislative when they actually have to draw the line. And carve out, the realm of the individual citizen. Because they are not serfs, they do not belong to the executive or the legislative. In some sense, the judiciary belongs to everyone, or at least the high court aspect. The higher courts in my legal system. But anyway, okay. Sorry, have I made a good enough exemplar of this kind of demonstration. So the practice of equality is contextual to the nature of the organization that people might both be members to, and the structure of that organization, and the use of prerogative and the power of prerogative that such an organization has. The idea that you can just get your constitutional rights guaranteed by you by any private organizational structure because you have these constitutional rights, and then people incorrectly think that they have the right to equality. So if you use your bodily autonomy to exercise your prerogative because the organization has a prerogative power over one of your subordinates, and essentially, well, my bodily autonomy is being invalidated by your choice to put me on leave, or your choice, something like that. That's irrelevant. You're not being kidnapped when you're being put on leave in that organization. You can't call up the police and say, "Hello, my bodily integrity is being infringed." I mean, that's an argument. And why should your bodily integrity in that way be equal to the holder of a prerogative's bodily autonomy to use his mouth to speak the words, "I'm putting you on leave"? The idea that your human integrity or human dignity has been infringed or something like that. This is the kind of hyperbolic. Sorry, this is kind of this is a very sort of complicated sort of matter to perhaps talk through, and I'm going through it a bit too quickly. But you get false reductions. You get very poor generalizations. When you lower yourself essentially to being sensitive to the feelings of people, when they're just not even interested in having a kind of system that works substantively, that works in principle, that works in morality, that essentially morality is just, it belongs to whoever can make the most lowest common denominator, sort of zero sum sympathy racketeering sort of propaganda about how everything needs to be an equal trade-off, and we all need to have the same human dignity in terms of the power over our subjective view of our own, sort of feelings about our rights not being equal. Anyway, and essentially rights become all about pride instead of human dignity. It goes actually out the window because people therefore are no longer protecting their dignity that they have. They are pridefully targeting someone else on the basis of envy. That there's it's a power grab essentially. It's this idea, well, you have more power than me and I can't justify it because of how I feel I've been treated. And so you're quite toxically leveraging this sense of relativistic feelings, and I mean, I don't need to retrace all of these sorts of things, but I mean, this is still an edifice on the left. The left is still completely beholden to this kind of stuff. To the extent that the people on the right have that kind of thinking as well, I would argue that at least you can engage at the individual level and disabuse them of these sorts of things. The left, you can't even do that, because for them to break rank, for them to break their party line, their whole narrative dissolves, and then they're completely fucked, essentially, because they require the fact that they are fighting against the bad guys. Otherwise, there's no excuse for them to continue to double down. So the immaturity, if it exists, is in individuals on the right, and it can be tackled individually. On the left, it doesn't belong to the individual; it belongs to their ideological gang, to their group. And I'll say this is why I'm afraid of the people on the left, essentially, is because you have to understand that the Nazis, in some sense, it can be argued, oh, what side of the divide are they on? Well, I'll just tell you, culturally and politically, the Nazis were the people on the left. They were the people that stormed the Senate hearings or whatever for Kavanaugh. It was not the people who symbolically did this reenactment of sedition while not intending sedition. This right-wing riot was a stunt, was very clearly a stunt. When people stormed the Kavanaugh hearings, they weren't doing it as a stunt. They actually wanted to install their mob rule or something like that. They were infused with the spirit of the Führer. The people on the right were not actually, even if you can misquote some of them or whatever, or when I say misquote, because what did they mean when they said the things that they said? They were there trying to create a symbolic protest, quite explicitly. Or were they actually trying to hold the building? Were they going to go and try and hold the building? No, never. In some sense, the people that stormed the Kavanaugh hearings were trying to delegitimize them so that they would be so derailed, so that essentially, they don't even know what. I mean, this is the same way in which, for example, before Kristallnacht in Weimar, Germany, they had to train the people to have the confidence to kind of take over the state, to have a military coup in Weimar, Germany. And how they did that was they would actually practice by ransacking stores, by storming like places that sold things and taking things. I mean, that's what's been happening in my country as well, interestingly enough. And that's what happens in left-wing riots. So anyway, if you have enough kind of historical consciousness about this stuff, and you know enough about psychology, and I would call myself a self-read expert in personality and such. I mean, I have quite a high opinion of my knowledge base of psychology, although I might not be able to justify that. But I mean, I have also collaborated with experts in the field, although there's no record of this. That sounds very strange, but anyway, actually, I mean, I believe I've been involved in very many things. So I'm either very mentally sick and a crackpot myself, or I'm a very serious person, and my theses should be taken quite seriously. But I'll just say that the fascists are the left-wing people. That if you understand that what Nazi actually meant was National Socialist German Workers' Party. The Nazi Party is a workers' party and a socialist party, and the national just means that the working socialists or whatever want to control the state for the family of the state. for the people that live there. And in some sense, you could say that the left, although supposedly the elite in the left are proto-fascist, whereas the people on the ground, the BLM sort of people, I would say that they are overtly fascists. I mean, but they both share the same fascistic conception of society. They just have, the one has an intellectual idea that you can have a rainbow Hitler, and the other one, in some sense, knows that the whole process of the revolution, as they might phrase it, is a form of arbitrating with these kinds of having arbitrators, having Führers that will actually take from some and give to another, and apportion blame and apportion a kind of collective systemic guilt for the inheritance of the corruption of actually promulgating the scapegoating on the ground. And they have a much more visceral idea of how that would happen on the ground. It's much the same as the Black Panther movement, which had the same confection within itself. The kind of, the white members, even the white liberal sort of sympathizers, would be like the proto-fascists. Hitler would have called these people useful idiots. And it's interesting because it's kind of like a historical chain as well, because you become part of something which seems like it's the formula of the solution, so you tell yourself that it's deserved, and then you kind of post hoc create a narrative, a moral narrative out of that, and then you cover over your own guilt with a kind of, with the defensiveness of that narrative. And then there's a whole section of pseudo-intellectuals that go out degrading anyone else who isn't responsive to that formula. And this is an unconscious mechanism that is known in Scientology. That is known, probably in some way, by some school of Jungian. I mean, it's ironic because so many Jungians are themselves plugged into, supposedly they know the phrase, what you resist persists. It gets inculcated into some other form because they're not willing to take responsibility. They're not willing to make the unconscious conscious. Or, I mean, there are toxic formulations of Jungian psychology, quite sadly, that, just the idea of the collective unconscious is itself an excuse to indulge in this kind of never-ending bullshit. And people have their particular, sort of hills, their trash hills, which they are the kings of. Anyway, I was going to tie this in to scientism, but also how people who get over scientism just sort of double it down into a different kind of anyway, this recording will go on forever if I just keep on mentioning this theme in other forms. This is, the left-wing narrative is so corrupt and dishonest that I just thought, after making the recording, that this is an addendum to, that I should go over some specific issues. For example, the whole thing that was brought up. I mean, in some sense, that if Donald Trump even lost the election, if he did, he lost it because he was successfully maligned as being a racist. And essentially the charge in him being a racist was that he did not condemn white supremacy. And, and this all comes down to the quote there were good people on both sides. And if you just play that quote and include the whole press conference, or you literally just add another minute of recording after he said that there were good people on both sides. If you continue listening a minute further, and he says, and I'm not talking about the white supremacists and the racists, I'm talking about the people, and he did actually specifically renounce them. He says, I can't remember exactly. I should find the exact quote, but it's disgusting that, like, I mean, essentially that you can just repeat a lie enough and it becomes true on the left. That literally, if you want to hear Donald Trump denouncing white supremacy, you just need to take the quote that is used, that he's supposedly dog whistling to white supremacists, and you just need to extend that quote by a minute, and then there he is renouncing them, denouncing them. Excuse me, that's a horrible way of misspeaking, renouncing. Um, but the issue here, as if he needs to renounce them, as if he's ever said anything in some sense, just other than using, let's say, common vernacular. I mean, all the things that he said that have been racist have all not been public quotes. They have been, the phrase "shithole country." Oh yeah, because that is somehow racist because of identity politics bullshit. Identity politics, systemic oppression, in which, well, if white people don't consider themselves to be to blame for everything wrong in the world, then if they use a disparaging word, then it's racist. You can't bootstrap political accountability anywhere for anything unless a white person is being blamed for it. That's through the filter of identity politics. Uh, yeah, it's all racist. Um, but the the weird thing about this as well is how it informs part of this kind of objective journalism sort of thing. Uh, hmm. That if you just make the lie bold enough, and you just kind of keep on reiterating it, that somehow the narrative becomes safe, essentially, because then essentially it's too dangerous to undermine that narrative. To you know, the nail that sticks up gets banged down. That's how everyone on the left essentially functions. They can't debate values. They can't discuss anything. It's essentially, they have a particular safe zone because that is how their whole ideology functions. Essentially, it's fundamental dishonesty. Um, but for me, it was always just strange, because I mean, you see Wallace in the debates themselves raising this point himself. Uh, it's weird. It's like because the left somehow makes it safe that if you just repeat the lie enough times, then it becomes the orthodoxy. Sort of, it becomes unquestionable, or even if it's unsubstantiated or if it doesn't even make sense, well, it's an approximation of the truth, and we need it for our whole ideological system to function. So you have a president that has record minority unemployment, low rate of unemployment, who has a non-racial coalition de facto. There are a lot of black and Hispanic Trump supporters. In some sense, for the first time, Republicans have actually broken into those demographics in terms of support. And he loses the election, in some sense, under the motif, under the slander that he's a racist, according to identity politics. And that whole narrative is essentially fabricated out of decontextualizing quotes. Because there's a news network that calls itself objective journalism, which is so objective that you can't argue with the questions, because their journalists are professional. That they're experts that come on and give their factoids. They can concoct whatever narrative they so wish, essentially, based on some technical reading of it, some technical reading of the truth that is all hinged on essentially this kind of satirical character assassination of the other side. It was exactly like the first impeachment, which was so intellectually disgusting. I mean, I spent kind of an hour going into that, but essentially it all hinges on character assassination. It all hinges on how much you can infer the underlying intention of Trump, essentially. Well, if he intended to be committing fraud, then that's what he was doing. Or if he intended to be trying to corrupt another government leader or something like that. This, I mean, it really is this kind of morality for me, but not for thee. This is the kind of, let's say, ambiguity that Trump represents, because how Trump operates expects people to know their own normative morality. In some sense, he expects normative morality to be in the system. So he doesn't filter what he says as if normative morality is something that has to be spoken into being. He assumes that normative morality exists. That is why regular people can listen to him and make and well, all the times that everything that he said is taken out of context. And if you would just, and this is why so many people, they become Trump supporters when they actually just watch a Trump speech. If they actually listen to the Mount Rushmore speech, they listen to any of his rallies in totality. Oh yeah, yeah, there's nothing offensive about that. And then you see how they decontextualize it on CNN, and you see how they concoct their narrative. It's essentially witchcraft. But I mean, just the blatant dishonesty about it. I mean, the good people on both sides is, I mean, frankly, that is essentially proof that the whole left wing sort of media establishment, the kind of brittle intellectualism. I mean, like, really, just like go find a YouTube video in which that whole press conference, and watch the whole press conference of the, and it's in the press conference that he denounces white supremacists and racists. It's in the actual press conference in which a quote is taken from that, and they say, well, this is proof that you haven't denounced white supremacists. Well, that just seems that way because CNN won't report objectively, or whatever that's supposed to mean, I guess. That they will objectively take things out of context. And I'm just trying to think of how to round out this point. But I mean, the horrible thing essentially is that that becomes then a canonical narrative that on the left that becomes the party line, and in some sense is concocted by this kind of lowest common denominator reality in which you can't look underneath it. You can't shatter it because then you can't be part of the club. Um, it's very, very toxic. That doesn't exist on the right. I mean, there might be bubbles of that on the right who are like literally, these people that are part of some kind of cult or something like that. And in some sense, those bubbles don't have pretensions of becoming, well, I mean, they might have some loose pretensions, but they don't have an ability to take over the whole right, um, because of the libertarian, classical liberal sort of right mentality. It doesn't really play on the right. If it exists on the right, it exists in individuals' understandings, and you can actually deal with that at some point. You can actually, you know, but I mean, in some sense, people have to honestly believe what they believe. Otherwise, you can't ever get them to change their beliefs about anything. The problem is that the beliefs on the left are fundamentally dishonest. They're functional. They're part of this idea that you can just kind of collectively make it, even though you individually don't understand it. Stay in your lane. You're part of this kind of world church. It's almost like a kind of pseudo religious kind of cult on the left. Those tendencies on the right, I mean, I would also be critical of them, but at least you can actually confront them and contend against them and intellectually do something perhaps against that, or in terms of responding to it and educating people or something like that. But the left form of inoculation to that is is worse than the fucking disease. And in some sense, their whole ivory tower is built on projecting evilness onto the other side. So a lot of the time, they're actually creating a safe harbor. Oh, this is the point that I was trying to get to, is that the idea that Donald Trump is a secret racist and that he's dog whistling to racists is concocted by the fucking left narrative. It's concocted for their ideological necessity. If they supposedly wanted to destroy white supremacy or something like that, all they would have to do is report on Donald Trump and emphasizing all the parts that he denounced white supremacy. They would just have to play that and talk about that. Or discuss the inconsistency between when he denounces them and when he supposedly doesn't seem to denounce them, and then ask for questions and clarification and actually do journalism about that. But they're not willing to develop that synthesis. They're not willing to ask those questions because they're too busy being objective decontextualists. The polarization is completely concocted from the left, by the toxicity of the left, by the kleptocracy, which is in some sense all more embodied by the left than the right. Although, at some point there's not quite such a difference between the establishment, on both sides. But ideologically speaking, the right is in much better shape, is in a much more responsive shape to the actual real state of politics. But there's such a large contingent of people who are effectively spiritually dead, or they're dead players. They are sympathy zombies, and they just you plug them into the narrative and you feed them the narrative, and then they'll do whatever you want. And anyway, that is my reading of it. That is, and I mean, although I'm giving it in a kind of metaphor and in a motif, that is essentially, the structure of these things. And the so-called pseudo-intellectualism of the left that kind of tries to paper over, essentially how their whole power structure is built on essentially these armchair philosophers that give the narrative down to these people who can essentially have this kind of collective narcissism, this ideological narcissism, that gives them the idea that they can just sort of project onto other people when they're right, when their validity is being invalidated, when their go-to security blanket of you're wrong and I'm right. In some sense, that's what the left is. It's a very juvenile form of sort of 4-year-old um, rhetorical semantic trickery that won't get into a values debate, uh, because they would rather just use a kind of an icon of false authority to create the space, the hypothetical fear that then lets them have their so-called sophistication. And it's just basically a protraction of that defense mechanism. So instead of essentially, when they say that Donald Trump needs to denounce these things, they're actually saying that Donald Trump needs to renounce them because that's what he is. It's kind of like their premises that they hide in their questions are fundamentally, they claim to be objectively true. They claim to be the chairman of objective, authoritative truth. They will not become participants. They are arbiters. They are Führers of the system. They are saviors of the narrative. And so you're not allowed to break their narrative or look underneath their narrative. Complete unconscious projection. I just particularly despise them because they're so fundamentally racist. There's so many racist stereotype built into their whole narrative structure. But essentially, that's how they get away with it, is that as long as they can be expressing sympathy for something, then they can indulge in whatever, sort of ivory tower, rule-based, I was going to talk about rule omega and why you have to understand that rule omega is essentially just a kind of protocol around first engagement or first contact. But if you're going to try to create an edifice out of rule omega, and not hold it more lightly or something like that, this idea that you have to always do yes and. Oh, I saw someone do a formulation of rule omega, which is incredibly intellectually dishonest, I guess. But in some sense, I think they have largely found a way to quash the spirit of the rule, in order to create a kind of, a false narrative around it, so that they can kind of control their fiefdom, or that they can kind of get away with. Anyway, I need to get into this research, I guess, to see what else is linked to this. Because anyway, I'm going to more pointedly talk to this, I guess. I feel like I should go and make this addendum to particularly reiterate a module argument. A lot of my political discourse in these recordings the flow is a bit too quick, and I'm not tentatively, I'm not attentive enough, excuse me, to cover and exhaust, a kind of an issue from all angles. But I just thought I should at least go back and try to clean up how I put down Yang, and sort of the basic income grant model of papering over the deep problem in society. And this really has to do with the motivation problem, not the perverse incentive problem, I should rather say, rather than motivation. But essentially that it awarding to people a freedom dividend, or whatever you want to call it, only works under the assumption that everyone that you give money to essentially is going to take that money and use it under the auspices of their sense of responsibility, that they're going to, that essentially how they use that money is going to inform part of their own personal responsibility and self-determinism. I don't think that you can make such an assumption. And I think that quite quickly the whole dynamic of that would, all the all the incentive structures are there essentially to undermine that very, very quickly culturally. And just another way of putting it, I would say, is that it would directly demoralize the culture. The culture itself would be directly demoralized as a result of granting a basic income grant, essentially. Because then essentially, I mean, okay, yeah, that's a hard issue to get into. But essentially, I do think that it would directly corrupt even the notion of responsibility. And when I say demoralize, I almost mean that in a technical way, because it would incentivize in people to quite explicitly develop an amoral attachment to their belonging to the society. That they would be perversely incentivized to concoct a compartmentalized amoralism about the system as a whole, that, well, it doesn't so matter that the rich are plutocratic and that they've taken over society and that they rule us like feudal lords because we get our dividends. So their richness is shared with us, or something like that. And I think that in some sense, so it would almost be like a Faustian bargain, but also that wouldn't. I mean, the real problem with it is that the money would be unqualified. The money would be regarded as basic, and when you basically do that, you uncouple morality from the functioning of the state, but in such a way that you are perversely incentivizing the amorality, the compartmentalized amorality of culture itself. So you've actually found a direct way to get the state, in some sense, to the amoralism of the state, and the kind of political gerrymandering in some sense. I do think that executive functions and legislative functions do have a role to play in promoting the public good. In some sense, that's the only function that they should have, because the state should already be compellable to do certain things and to have constitutional duties to its citizens. But that essentially the purpose of government is to do nice things on top of that, and to work out how to do nice things within the structure that already exists for its people. And to just kind of generalize that into a freedom dividend or a basic income grant, I think, is to not do the intelligent work that government needs to have in order to make a transformative, progressive society that actually ameliorates disadvantages, if that is the chosen moral course of action. But essentially, that is, in some sense, I think, how governments should be judged, by how good the effects of their policy is. And the problem with the basic income grant is that it would have positive effects, but its negative effects would all be essentially long term. So its cultural unsustainability would be hidden, and in some sense it would be such a successful program because essentially it would take responsibility for all positive statistical, so if there was any positive statistical measurement to be made about the system, the basic income grant could say, well, yeah, it's because of this, it's because of that. And all the negative that didn't perhaps have to be there, well, it doesn't have to be intelligence enough. It just has to say, well, the good will outweigh the bad. You see, it's going to be compartmentalized amoralism, and it's going to be demoralization of the culture itself. It's going to remove morality from culture. It's going to breed it out of them in some sense. Because I mean, it's something like the idea of so if you want, I am not my brother's keeper, but this policy is trying to have it both ways, that it is your brother's keeper, but it isn't your brother's keeper. It's not going to work. And in some sense, if people get encultured to that kind of strange have your cake and eat it, you are creating a model of something which I'll just say is wholly psychologically unsustainable. It, that kind of treatment cannot be understood by most people, by especially the people that have it within them to be perversely incentivized. Um, and essentially, I think that uh, it would create an immediate form of. I mean, if you're going to do anything like this, what you should rather do is you should have public companies be given some kind of ownership, some kind of percentage ownership. It shouldn't be by the function of taxation. It should be by the function of like having some kind of trust and some kind of shares in public companies that are related to the trust or something like that. Because then at least it's understandable, and then at least, oh, okay, well, and then these public companies are I mean, even that, because then at least you can be sensitive to the limits of the structure itself. I mean, the other alternative, which I've also said, is that I think a basic income grant would also perhaps uh, be manageable if it was sporadic, if it was essentially, if it was granted to you as a dispensation for a certain year of your life in your age or something like that, that like you get it for 1 year when you're 18, you get it for 1 year when you're 25, you get it for 1 year when you're 28 or something like that, and you can kind of, so it's some kind of cultural benchmark that gives you more opportunity to be responsible, and then it goes away and then you get it back again or something like that. And because essentially that would be the only way, I think, to actually make it still capable of falling under the rubric of developing responsibility and morality or something like that. And then people would always argue, well, it's arbitrary. So I mean, what, if you actually made it into a game, which is almost what you would have to do for people not to be perversely incentivized, to be completely entitled to it, and then be dependently enslaved by that fixed relationship, by that encultured codependency. And you could say, well, only some bad people would do that, and then those people would have themselves to blame, and they would drink themselves to death, or they would use it unwisely. Um, I mean, I would say as well that if you were going to do it, you should legalize all drugs completely, um, and have them be made as safely and cheaply as possible, and produced and mass produced at the cheapest price possible. Um, all narcotic drugs, so that essentially people that could want to fall for that, let's just say, and not be a part of a culture of life that has a freedom dividend attached to it, then they can kind of check themselves out towards oblivion or something like that. And then because in some sense, you can't have a freedom dividend and then not also have a kind of morality check, because in some sense, the freedom dividend is already the idea that amoralism is the secular space is marked by amoralism, is the culture is demoralized to the extent to which that the state blanketly endorses, blanketly is the guarantor that in an unquestioningly way that people are entitled to a basic income, and that somewhat breaks, uh, let's say, the authenticity within the structure of the human condition, or at least it untethers us, as it also tethers us to the state. It untethers us from, let's say, being grounded in reality in some sense, and I don't mean reality but in the reality of at least our ancestral lines of our deep, sort of being connected, and it really is to create a weird kind of new human being in the image of the government, in the image of its relation to government. Um, so I'll just caution that this is a major kind of experiment, and you don't know what the long-term consequences of it are. But in some sense, it's you are becoming more overtly a kind of French than kind of model of culture. So I'll just point all of that out. Um, and quite obviously, it's more. I mean, in some sense, I guess this kind of policy is where you start getting the agreement between the ethnocentric types, the ethno-nationalists even love this kind of policy. In fact, um, it's also because it gives the plutocratic elite of a society complete free reign. The Ku Klux Klan has always been the kind of the culture around I mean, you think it was nice being a working class white in the South. I mean, you had to believe so much retarded narrative propaganda about states' rights to think that slavery was a good thing for you. I mean, if you were a working class white in the South, I mean, it was, I guess it was great for the 1% slave owning classes that could conscript you to hunt for slaves that had escaped. So you always had to worry about being conscripted. Uh, your wages were effectively depressed by the fact that they were slaves. Um, the whole system. I mean, it only makes sense for the land owning aristocracy, and in some sense, that's always been the compact. In some sense, that if you are part of that culture, then they'll give you some supposed identitarian dignity, that your race or your category is ennobled somehow by the existence of slavery as an ideological propaganda, which is in some sense also necessary because of the constitutional framing of America. The kind of the dehumanizing aspect of slavery was a necessary component because of the framing of the Constitution. I would frankly argue, but that in some sense the this in-group out-group drama is the perfect excuse to have an unaccountable political sort of free hand. It's always been the tool of kleptocrats. Well, I mean, this is almost the basic psychology of people who often orientate themselves towards leadership. I mean, you always have these dregs. You always have these sadistically edged field marshalling, false conscious, sort of and they're always in the revolutionary classes as well, are essentially the burgeoning wannabe new aristocrats, with their new false consciousness, with their new, sort of very disguised form of neo-kleptocracy and neo-plutocracy that just is a slightly different orientation of the entire game. It's just an updated narrative. Um, and you've seen that also completely throughout the American experiment. You've seen how, I mean, I believe that the party of the KKK, the Democratic Party, has always has that's it's always been its character. That's always been its ideological bent. Um, and they've just worked long and hard enough to reimagine their same sympathy formula within a history which they have been able to decontextualize and rematerialize and retell. Um, but in some sense, otherwise, they don't know how to make a culture in which status has a kind of a moral virtue built into it. You know, that's something of the entire American corruption. That wealth and status is automatically identified with some kind of moral fiber. And I mean, I do think that there is definitely something to that in people that do make it. Uh, that there is a kind of dynamism. Um, Although I would argue in the sort of in the tech space that, you know, the kind of, I mean, you see that there's a huge moral gap. There's a huge rift between these people's sort of technical cultural savvy in terms of accessing, you know, people's intellectual um, and a holistic view of the human condition, and a political understanding and a moral understanding. You know, all of those sorts of things are completely misaligned. Um, you know, these people have very low resolution models of these other things, and this is in some sense under the rubric of the American system. You know, because it's essentially you just need to beseech a lawyer and get a lawyer to fill you in on the precedent of how these things are governed. And you know, when you actually see the boundaries, the rules, and the conditions of the game on that level, it is not fit for purpose. I mean, America does not have the rule of law. In fact, the rule of law, when it's spoken of in American terms, is somewhat relating to the fact that there's peace on the streets or something like that, or that there could be peace on the streets. You know, that keeping the peace is something of is the closest motif that America has to a concept of the rule of law, but it doesn't actually have the rule of law, because the law itself is trial and error, is being concocted on the fly. In principle, the law is not complete and a law of general application. It is being repealed and repromulgated and designed, and new creatures of regulation are devised. And it's an experimentation. You can't have the rule of law when the substance of the law is trial and error. How can judges dispense justice under those conditions when they are just secretaries, when they cannot investigate the deep structure of the law, because it has no deep structure, it has no deep coherence, it has no principles other than principles of process and procedure, and a procedural fairness which does not amount to the rule of law. Equal protection under the law within a due process system doesn't mean anything if I mean, it means it's better than nothing. But it doesn't mean anything if the laws are not laws of general application. If I lose a court case because of the state of the law, and then the law changes afterwards, if the whole form of the law changes afterwards, can I go back and relitigate my case? Can I at least escape the liability that I may be accrued in that case, the civil liability? Can I be rescued? No, because the principle of the thing is bound by a place and by a time. It's not a law of general application. But I mean, this is more egregious when you are a citizen going up against a leviathan, going up against the state itself, perhaps with its special prerogative powers. Anyway, I'm not going to I talk about this in enough of my other recordings, but okay, so I think I spoke about the Andrew Yang sort of thing, but yeah, I mean, I also go on about this in my other shadow work recordings when I talk about sustainability versus the trade-off between sustainability and sympathy. That if you indulge into sympathy, you are destroying sustainability, and there's essentially no way to get around that unless you're dealing more directly and more intelligently with the human condition. And I mean, in some sense, this, you have to try to make, if you want to promote people's welfare, you have to make laws of general application that target objective criteria, and then you have to judge your policy based on its merits and based on how well it gets people through that program or something like that. And you have to be very careful, because you might even have a success. I would say all programs that essentially you'll say, well, we'll always need this program. Those are very dangerous programs, because those are programs that create perverse incentives within culture. You say, well, we need a way to help families that have been broken or something like that feed their children. And if you create that kind of trap, that kind of a perverse incentive, that you've made a policy device, now you have just essentially incentivized, the soft oppression of low expectations and low, in some sense, now there's going to be no cultural signal. There's going to be no idea of, I mean, you're already, what has been undermined in the American system is self-determinism and responsibility. And also at the same time, you've got these sort of very badly democratic run municipal structures of revenue collection, which are very disgustingly antithetical to upward mobility. I mean, there are thousands of examples like this, I would probably think, but the idea that you use toll roads to pay not for roads but for everything. So in some sense, you're saying that so everyone that uses transportation ends up having to pay a hugely inflated cost of doing business, of just going to and from their work, through these toll road systems. And you'll probably find that that's a huge disproportionate tax against the lower classes relative to their income. That's a huge impediment and a bar to actually accumulating savings and investing in things like skills and or education or development or other, I mean, this is, I mean, essentially I would say, everyone always complains that wages need to go up. No, it's not the wages that need to go up, it's the cost of living that needs to go down. But government is fundamentally on this model, which in some sense is weirdly trying to crack down on the middle class more than the rich. So, but essentially with its progressive propaganda or whatever, it's essentially trying to create obstacles for people becoming middle class. And it's very hard to not create a system that creates obstacles for people to becoming middle class when you're perversely incentivizing so much in some senses a kind of practical demoralization. If I gained more independence by getting a car, suddenly my overhead for using that car because of the toll roads, and the amount of money one has to spend on even public transport is exorbitant. Because that is how tax collection functions uh, in this municipality. And it's weird how things seem to work for a season, um, until you start seeing the medium and long term effects of this and how it depresses people, how it, let's say, the disproportionate distribution of the costs on the different classes. And in some sense, you could say, well, the rich, in some sense, are fiddled with the least, are by far the least. I mean, they don't care how you take it, generally speaking, how you tax. Uh, they can manage their affairs so sort of it all comes out in the wash. But when these things are not, let's say, structured in such a way that it makes very clear, fair sense to very poor people, you've essentially kicked away the ladder in mobility and so in class mobility. And you've also obscured the vision of how to sort of do things. I mean, anyway, there are lots of states in America. I mean, I guess this kind of forces you to have to try to work out what the deal is where, and then sort of go to a place that perhaps has a different mix of these kinds of things. But anyway, I was going to make a broader point about sort of Democrats experimenting on people. They do have this kind of this very cheap formula built into it, which is basically that, well, if you can indulge in intellectual sympathy and get away with it, then it proves that you're a genius, kind of thing. Well, I mean, I think that's actually a misuse of the word genius, but it proves that you're a very smart intellectual. It's a vindication of your smartness. Uh, and in some sense, a lot of what the Democratic Party is it's in some sense the doubling down of trying to sustain the narrative about itself and be unaccountable for the consequences of its terrible policies, uh, which it can only do by holding the party line and by keeping this formula alive that has effectively gone without proper reprocessing, redigestion of the history. While they sort of cherry pick these very particular kinds of things, to create this fake narrative around identity politics, which, quite frankly, you have to be completely on board with decontextualizing history to get a very oversimplified vision, a very watered down caricature uh, of reality, even as you kind of make yourself into a self-denigrated caricature just to go along with that disgusting narrative that sells you this weird kind of self-esteem inflation, which you can't, it never actually empowers you, but to keep on trying to extract it from some target that the narrative tells you is the cause of all evil or something like that. Anyway, okay, this is going to be another addendum specifically focusing on COVID, because I also probably embarrassingly talked about that subject without rounding out the main sort of structure of the kind of argument that I'm making, which is I probably put it in much too sort of hyperbolic terms, but yeah, no, I mean, I guess it is a bit of a messy argument, but it is a necessary one, and in some sense, it reinforces the motif that I was exploring in the sort of in the democratic vision of just papering over the cracks and expecting to double down on the long-term moral consequences or the long-term, medium-term sort of secondary side effects from the course of action. That, you kick the can down the road. And in the same way, at least the current methodological, in some sense, I think that a lot of the COVID-19 reaction was not responsible. It was not in accord with the swine flu outbreak, with how that was treated by public health officials. Um, and I do think that, I mean, there's a fundamental problem in your sort of what who owns public health, especially when it's being uh, essentially dictated by experts um, that we're not allowed to question, that we're not allowed to publicly debate the merits and the substance of how the field sets itself up, and to even frankly talk about the controversy within the field. Many luminary experts, Professor Sunepta Gupta, Professor Leonidas from Stanford. Professor Sunepta Gupta is the leading Oxford epidemiologist. Professor Leonidas used to have, I believe, Fauci's job in America. These are people who, right from the start, said that a lockdown was unprecedented. It did not make sense effectively. Not for this kind of virus, not for a COVID type of virus, which now we have gone to war with, and we expect will not mutate after we've gone to war with it and after we try to slow it down, even after we have hospital capacity. Well, we make this public health enemy number one, and all other public health enemies, it doesn't matter the casualty and the carnage attached to those vectors, because only COVID-19 has been elevated to prominence in journalism. A journalism that I would argue has been radicalized by identity politics, by wishing to look at everything in the frame of systemic oppression and systemic narrative conditioning, that we must always react to the systemic condition, that there's no such thing as a risk that a government official can't be expected to leverage as reason to dream up some overprotective, but also then have, that's the only way that they can kind of keep their status of political unaccountability, is be as reactive as possible to the narrative. Um, so I would say the biggest failure that we've had is because journalism has been corrupted by identity politics. Effectively, all all journalistic sort of media institutions and establishments, um, very few exceptions. The exceptions, if they exist, are sort of on the classical libertarian, anti-authoritarian sort of mentality. But the left has become essentially a hotbed for this kind of um, ideological demagoguery, which is exactly the kind of social justice motif which was created and which made Hitler the most popular leader in Europe before the Second World War. Hitler was regarded as being, you know, really a wonderful person because of his kind of moralizing, which is now broadcast by these kinds of journalists who won't even properly investigate stories because they don't want to break the narrative. Because the narrative is so brittle and so unsubstantiatable, it's so unjustifiable. It cannot bear any kind of scrutiny. It's that weak and pathetic. And the dogma and the moralistic orthodoxy behind identity politics is so toxic, is so fascistic, is so prone to scapegoating and projecting onto people, um, that it will justify anything about itself. I mean, it's exactly how the Nazis did all the horrible things that they did, essentially. Um, that's the kind of the modern narrative, which is roughly. Anyway, I've got lectures where I go specifically into this quite deeply, and I talk about the cultural roots of this and feminism, uh, developing intersectional feminism that developed identity politics. But sort of culturally how this operates on the ground. Anyway, and now we're seeing the same formula creep into all bits of secular life as it has crept into public health. So much so that people cannot make common sense, reasonable policy, intelligent policy cannot be had when people that are empowered by this kind of formulaic leveraging of the narrative can decontextualize and narrate reality into a kind of objective, moral, scientific, expert, sort of argument. That's all premised on false dichotomies, on false dilemmas, on hypothetical fears. So, you have to prove a negative against their boogeyman, essentially, because otherwise the blood is on your hands, sort of thing. And then you can't even track if any of these things are a self-fulfilling prophecy. If having such an extensive lockdown is what causes mutation, is what causes the virulence to increase, because you're creating a selective pressure against the virus, and you're saying, well, if you, I mean, the strange idea that we were ever going to eradicate this virus, before we even knew that we had a vaccine coming, and who knows if the vaccine is really in the long term going to be a good solution or not. While you essentially elicit people in the health sector to sing sob stories about how they're terrible working conditions, as if anyone who speaks out against what is a controversial public health policy, what should be a controversial public health policy, and what we should be getting down to the bottom of it and investigating it and looking at it from both sides. Instead, we just get fed a disgusting form of propaganda and scapegoating of anyone who just doesn't accept it and go along with it. I mean, this is a political manifestation of the disease of the political arena and essentially the normalization of proto-fascist politics, which I would say has by and large happened because of identity politics. And this is the testing of the waters of taking the model of identity politics and applying it through the vector of public health until things become self-fulfilling prophecies. Because whatever happens, essentially, you can say that the idea of hard lockdown was the most responsible way to go. And when do you ever judge these things? When do you ever review those claims? You're only allowed to review them when the government says that you're allowed to review them, essentially. And what I do actually worry about is that the more we lock down, the more deadly the virus will actually become, but also that the more deadly all viruses will become, because people, the immune, you know that in a fish tank, you have much less problems with bacteria in a fish tank the more species of fish you have in the tank. If you have one species of fish in a fish tank, if the pH balance goes a little bit wonky, if something changes, the whole thing suddenly has like a crazy outgrowth of something. It has a crazy, the whole thing goes out of whack so quickly. That's like what a lockdown is. That you break down the immunological transfer of information between individuals. And you're cooping up everyone into creating strains that know that they're in the same host and that there isn't a kind of, it's harder for them to spread. You're creating selective pressures, and you're also, in some sense, creating less exposure to people's, so in some sense, you're creating a paradigm in which people shouldn't have to have immune systems because the world should just be clean. That's the kind of the stupid premise that is woven into this kind of long-term thinking, is that there's no sense of proportionate, intelligent design of any kind of plan to do with COVID. It's this fake idea that lockdowns were actually going to eradicate the virus, which was never a possibility. But somehow that generalization is the gist of all the journalistic coverage of this stuff. I remember very early in the virus, there was even someone on the radio who was being interviewed from the local university, which used to be, I would say, a renowned global university, probably not so much anymore. But and at the end of the interview, the guy actually said, well, actually we should ease the restrictions now because we have spare capacity in the hospital. And in some sense making the point, and it was made right at the end of the interview. This was like a 30-minute interview, and right at the very end, he says, well, actually, we should really be seriously politically thinking at drawing back these restrictions because now we've actually got spare capacity in the hospital. In some sense, the common sense is that we need to reach herd immunity. There's no other way. Lockdowns don't eradicate the virus. Is the premise of that kind of remark. And the journalist didn't even know how to react to that because it broke the current media narrative so badly that was coming out of America, which was probably designed to undermine Trump more so than anything else. It was a useful cudgel that was available at the time. And they could get experts to rally behind it. Because it wasn't that hard, essentially. There's always a controversial plethora of different opinions within every field. And sadly, not everyone in medicine, anyway. And I must say, I was a consumer of the contrarian line very, very quickly because they made very thorough surveys of it, and they explain the complexity is that, well, the problem is that we know a lot about COVID viruses, but you can never know that the next COVID virus is the same as all the other COVID viruses in a technical way. So in some sense, you can say, well, we don't know what we're doing, so we should be as cautious as possible. You can always leverage almost a hard skepticism of technical possibility. And when some experts are allowed to do that, instead of taking it in the round, then essentially you allow the whole system to get hijacked, and it has been hijacked by stupid experts and by a world consensus, which I think had more to do with Trump and Brexit than it had to do with the actual science. And when you actually look at people who are very serious about evidence-based science and medicine, evidence-based medicine, and looking through this, no very clear case has ever been made for these kinds of restrictions. It is as if we were trying to eradicate the virus with a lockdown. That's the loose logic which gets somewhat communicated through these stupid journalists who have lost all objectivity, who have no grounding in reality. But I mean, that's been that way since identity politics. So we've normalized this kind of false consciousness and this crazy, insane rhetoric of this weird kind of self-entitlement that's based on, well, if it was hypothetical that some politician could be accountable for not being a better provider of security to some marginalized group, then no one wants to get thrown out of office for essentially making a principled stand against an expert. In some sense, this is all the curse of what was done to Thabo Mbeki, even though he did make concessions, he did change the point that was being complained about. We did have that debate. In some sense, you could have said, well, that's the debate that we even needed to have, because we're the country in which people rape small children in order to cure AIDS. So maybe we did need to have that debate conclusively and have it in the political consciousness so that we could all get on the same page about it, but also know the complexities of medicine. But no, instead we got this idea that the immune system is not important, it's drugs and pharmaceuticals that are important. That there's no long-term idea that the health of the immune system in the population needs to be conserved and needs to, that side of the argument in which Thabo Mbeki was just being completely pilloried and thrown away so that we could, give the country over to Zuma and his faction who made, ample use of that kind of polarization, of that kind of cheap and easy way to profit under the auspices of false authorities and oversimplified solutions. And it's interesting how the history of South Africa and the moral signals that South Africa, which I do think that it is the leading legal tradition in the world, which now is completely institutionally corrupt in law, but because of politics first, that we see that the kind of political misalignment within the ANC and its unaccountability and its the fact that it has just gotten away with it at every point, and it escapes accountability for its own unintelligent policy, that it never takes responsibility for its failures, and it can always just double down because of identity politics and because of this disgusting political atmosphere by these race and gender studies academics that undermine the Constitution, that have betrayed constitutional values, and they've gotten away with it. And the judges have accommodated them and have even adopted their disgusting ideology, their disgusting racism, their racialist consciousness that drives everything that is written in the law itself, in the Promotion of Equality Act. So that instead of growth in a country that should be developing, we have the growth of racial consciousness instead. Well, the feminists and these proto-fascist identitarians keep on saying that, well, it's the white patriarchy or something like that. always able to divert the blame. In the same way that the experts behind COVID will always be able to divert the blame in the kind of narrative that they're playing, because in some sense they can always say, well, we were avoiding a greater calamity. When we very easily could have reached herd immunity already while protecting the vulnerable, while quarantining the vulnerable and everyone else getting herd immunity. We could have avoided a strain mutation. We could have used the time that we had spare hospital capacity to avoid the crunch that we are receiving now. And all of this gets buried under the history, under the fake narrative that is spun by journalists. So, and in some sense, what is really scary is what's going to happen in the future. What happens when there's a mutation in COVID that the current vaccine doesn't cover, and it's even more deadly or something like that? Because in some sense now we're breeding it just to be more deadly and more contagious, because now we're going to war with it. We're using a vaccine to go to war with it, and we've been at war with it. You declare war, and then you're surprised that there's a militarization, that there's an arms race. We did not do this to swine flu. If we did this to swine flu, I bet swine flu would have been much worse than COVID, because I do think that actually swine flu is worse than COVID to begin with. And then what we've now received is a man-made, government-created crisis on top of a natural crisis. A natural tragedy, which in some sense is not even as bad as natural tragedies used to be, because every 20 to 30 years we used to have deadly viruses that would kill children at the same rate that they killed the elderly. This is not such a virus. This virus does not kill children at the same rate that it kills the elderly. And we don't even know the true mortality figures, because confirmed cases is not how you do science. That's not how you work out the denominator. But again, all of these problems have been compounded by the fact that we've gone to war with COVID, and we've never gone to war with the COVID virus before. Right now we're in the realm of human experimentation. We're experimenting with public health on a scale that has never been done before. And we don't know what the fallout will be. Maybe we'll have other viruses now. Maybe we'll be breeding other deadly viruses now and other deadly strains of bacteria. And what was Thabo Mbeki's message actually was that we need to raise the efficacy of people's native immune systems. That is somewhat of the only sustainable solution to this problem. Actually, Thabo Mbeki was right. Actually, I mean, this is not to say that antiretrovirals don't have their place in medicine. But we're not willing to have that kind of sophisticated, nuanced investigation of these fields and what's going on when we've got an expert who will just act as a false authority. And we've got a consensus, and we'll just follow that no matter what the consequence. And it can all be rationalized as a legitimate government purpose. But quite frankly, that's not good enough in a supreme constitution that has rights that can only be limited through the limitations clause. And there's no mention in the limitations clause of a governmental prerogative. If they want to say that their limitation and infringement of rights are justifiable, they have to actually justify it in practice, that the practice of their policy is a justifiable infringement, not their prerogative, their hypothetical vision and purpose that the prerogative is hypothetical purposes do not fit in to the limitations clause to the extent to which that the institutionalized corruption is trying to create the sacred cow of a governmental prerogative. It does not fit in the South African system. It fits in the American system, which is also why the American system does not have the rule of law and why it is fundamentally morally deficit, but also deficit in so many other ways, in which, well, that's what happens when you haven't updated your constitutional order and you create a legal structure, in the aftermath of a I mean, in some sense, they perhaps should have worked this out before they try to build for independence through a war. You have the war first, and then you make the reason for the war post hoc, and then you have to have a legal tradition that supposedly embodies the verification of the necessity of the war. That's what the American system is. That's the shadow. That's the unconsciousness of the American system. It's not an unimportant historical experiment, but it is an experiment that we don't have to run in South Africa. We have a better legal tradition, although it has been betrayed and gutted and hollowed out by the enemies of the democratic revolution, who are in the judiciary, who have betrayed the values of the Constitution, who have institutionalized the corruption, the political corruption in the ANC, who, as far as I can see, need to be impeached. Just from a rule of law perspective, just to reclaim the rule of law in South Africa. But anyway, or perhaps the structure of the law cannot be repaired because of the nature of the corruption. It's very sad. That a country that had so much promise and hope had that hope stolen and betrayed by officials who would not be held accountable because journalism itself has essentially fallen into this cult that again comes from America, essentially. And that's an American constitutional crisis that America deserves, but South Africa does not deserve any of that. Or in some sense, we only deserve it because, as a citizenry, we did not act to remove the people who threatened our order, our legal order, our constitutional order, as it is even now flagrantly threatened and undermined by demagoguery and politics of the worst kind, of the worst form of illiberal, authoritarian, tyrannical exploitation and political unaccountability. But this is a moral corruption in some sense. And to the extent to which that the state has fallen diseased because of this moral corruption, and the political arena has not been able to fight off this moral corruption, I can't say anything other than a people does deserve the government that it gets in a democracy. I mean, in some sense, the sad thing is that when other people sort of go down with the ship, but perhaps those people need to take more responsibility. And I do take that as, it will be a reflection on myself, the fate of this country. That's how I regard it.